At 4:17 p.m. on August 7, 1944, Staff Sergeant Michael Kovac sat in the commander's cupola of his M4 Sherman tank near Mortagne, France. His tank was part of a screening force that had just discovered 6 German Panther tanks moving into ambush positions. The Panthers hadn't seen the American tanks yet, which gave Kovac's platoon perhaps 30 seconds before the Germans spotted them. Kovac's Sherman was outgunned, out-armored and outnumbered. The Panthers had 75mm guns that could penetrate his Sherman's armor from 1,500 yards. His Sherman's 75mm gun could only penetrate a Panther's frontal armor from inside 300 yards. Standard doctrine said to withdraw immediately when facing superior enemy armor. But if Kovac's platoon simply retreated, they'd expose their thinner rear armor to the Panthers. The Germans would destroy all 4 American tanks before they escaped. Kovac had an idea that violated every tank manual and would probably get him court-martialed if it failed. He would order his platoon to retreat in reverse, driving backward while keeping their turrets facing the enemy. They'd maintain frontal armor protection while withdrawing and continue firing at the Panthers. It was an insane maneuver that no one had attempted in combat. Tanks weren't designed to fight while reversing, and the visibility would be terrible. But Kovac believed it was the only way to survive the next 5 minutes. What happened over those 5 minutes would prove that unconventional tactics could defeat superior firepower, would show that fighting backward could break a carefully prepared Panzer ambush, would change how American tank crews thought about retreat and defensive maneuvers. Michael Kovac was 23 years old in August 1944. He'd been born in Cleveland, Ohio, the son of Czech immigrants who worked in steel mills. Growing up during the Depression, Michael learned to drive at age 12, operating delivery trucks for his uncle's business. By age 16, he could drive almost anything with wheels and had an intuitive feel for vehicle handling. He joined the Army in 1942 and volunteered for armored forces. His driving skills made him a natural fit for tank operations, and he excelled in training. Kovac earned his tank commander qualification in early 1943 and shipped to England in December. He landed in Normandy on June 12, 1944, 6 days after D-Day, as part of the 3rd Armored Division. By August, Kovac had been in combat for 2 months and had survived 11 tank versus tank engagements. He'd learned hard lessons about the Sherman tank's vulnerabilities against German armor. The M4 Sherman was the primary American medium tank of World War II. It weighed 33 tons, carried a crew of 5, and was armed with a 75mm main gun. The Sherman was reliable, mechanically sound, and produced in enormous quantities. But it had significant weaknesses when fighting German heavy tanks. The Sherman's frontal armor was only 2.5 inches thick, which could be penetrated by most German tank guns. Its side and rear armor were even thinner, just 1.5 inches. The Sherman's 75mm gun was effective against German Mark III and Mark IV tanks, but it struggled against the frontal armor of Panthers and Tigers. American tank doctrine acknowledged these limitations and emphasized different tactics. German crews were taught to use mobility, numbers, and combined arms operations to overcome their disadvantages. When facing superior German armor, the doctrine was clear: avoid direct engagement. Call for air support, artillery, or tank destroyers with heavier guns. If forced to engage, use flanking maneuvers to hit the enemy's thinner side armor. Never fight Panthers or Tigers head-on unless you had overwhelming numerical superiority. By August 1944, the German army was launching Operation Lüttich, a counter-offensive aimed at splitting Allied forces in Normandy. The Germans committed substantial armored forces, including multiple Panzer divisions. American forces around Mortagne found themselves facing aggressive German tank attacks. On August 7th, Kovac's platoon was conducting a reconnaissance sweep south of Mortagne. The platoon consisted of 4 Sherman tanks moving in a staggered column formation. They were scouting for German positions and weren't expecting to encounter enemy armor. At approximately 4:15 p.m., Kovac's tank crested a small ridge, and he spotted movement in a tree line 800 yards ahead. Through his binoculars, he identified 6 Panther tanks moving into concealed positions. The Panthers were setting up an ambush along the road that Kovac's platoon had been ordered to secure. The German tanks hadn't spotted the American Shermans yet because they were focused on preparing their ambush positions. Kovac immediately radioed his platoon leader and reported the enemy armor. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, ordered an immediate withdrawal. Hayes knew that 4 Shermans couldn't fight 6 Panthers in open terrain. The order was to reverse course, retreat behind the ridge, and call for artillery support. But Kovacs saw a problem with that plan. The moment the Shermans turned around, the Panthers would see them. The ridge they were on was only about 6 feet high, not enough to provide complete concealment. As the Shermans turned and drove forward to retreat, they'd be silhouetted against the skyline. The Panthers would engage immediately, and the Shermans would be hit from behind where their armor was thinnest. It would take the Shermans at least 30 seconds to turn around and get over the ridge. In that 30 seconds, the Panthers could fire multiple rounds and probably destroy most of the American tanks. Kovacs keyed his radio and made a suggestion to Lieutenant Hayes. Instead of turning around, what if they reversed down the ridge backward? They could keep their frontal armor facing the Panthers and maintain the ability to return fire. Hayes initially thought Kovacs was joking because the suggestion seemed absurd. Tanks didn't fight in reverse, and driving backward over rough terrain was extremely difficult. But Kovacs pressed his case, explaining that it was their only chance. If they turned around, they were dead, but if they reversed while fighting, they might survive. Hayes had about 5 seconds to make a decision. He could follow standard doctrine and order a conventional retreat, which would probably get them killed. Or he could try Kovacs' crazy idea, which might also get them killed, but at least gave them a fighting chance. Hayes ordered the platoon to execute Kovacs' maneuver. All 4 tanks would reverse in unison, maintaining their spacing and keeping guns pointed forward. Drivers would use their periscopes and guidance from the tank commanders. Gunners would engage any Panther that revealed itself. The maneuver began at 4:17 p.m. Kovacs' driver, Private James Murphy, shifted into reverse and began backing down the ridge slope. Kovacs stood in the cupola, watching the Panthers through his binoculars with one hand while guiding Murphy with the other. He'd tap Murphy's left or right shoulder to indicate steering corrections. The Sherman's top reverse speed was only 5 miles per hour, agonizingly slow. Murphy had to navigate backward over uneven ground, using only his limited periscope view. The tank lurched and swayed as it rolled over bumps and depressions. Meanwhile, Kovacs' gunner, Corporal Thomas Briggs, kept the main gun trained on the tree line where the Panthers were positioned. The other 3 Shermans in the platoon were executing the same maneuver. All 4 tanks were reversing down the ridge in a line, maintaining their formation. It looked completely bizarre, like watching a formation drive in slow-motion rewind. For about 15 seconds, nothing happened. The Panthers hadn't noticed the American tanks yet, and the Shermans continued their backward retreat. Then one of the Panther commanders spotted the movement on the ridge. The lead Panther's turret swung toward the American tanks. Kovacs saw the movement and shouted for Briggs to fire. Briggs already had the Panther in his sights and pulled the trigger. The Sherman's 75mm gun fired with a sharp crack and recoil that rocked the reversing tank. The shot hit the Panther's frontal glacis plate, but didn't penetrate. However, it achieved something valuable. It made the Panther commander hesitate. The German had expected easy targets, not Shermans that were shooting back while retreating. That moment of confusion bought the American tanks a few more precious seconds. The Panther fired back, its 75mm gun booming across the open ground. The shot passed over Kovacs' Sherman, missing by about 3 feet. The Panther's gunner had misjudged the range because the Shermans were moving backward, which looked unnatural. The German gunner had aimed where he expected the tank to be, but the Sherman was moving away from that point instead of toward it. By now, all 6 Panthers had spotted the American tanks and were engaging. Shells began landing around the reversing Shermans, throwing up dirt and smoke. But the German gunners were struggling because the target behavior was so unusual. Tanks normally either advanced or turned to retreat, and gunners were trained to lead those movements. But these Shermans were backing away while facing forward, which threw off the German aiming calculations. Kovacs' tank had now reversed about 50 yards and was starting to get hull down behind the ridge crest. The hull was below the ridgeline, but the turret was still exposed above it. This gave Kovacs' Sherman some protection, while still allowing it to shoot. Briggs fired again, aiming at a Panther that had moved slightly out of its covered position. This shot struck the Panther's side turret, penetrating the thinner armor. The Panther stopped moving and began smoking, its crew bailing out. One Panther down, 5 to go. The other Shermans were also firing while reversing, creating a sustained exchange of gunfire. One of the Panthers scored a hit on Lieutenant Hayes's tank, striking the frontal armor. The shot penetrated and disabled the tank, but the crew managed to evacuate safely. Now 3 Shermans were still fighting and reversing. Kovac's tank continued backing down the slope, the driver navigating by feel and Kovac's directions. They were now almost completely hull down, with only the turret visible from the German position. This made them much harder targets. Kovac realized that the backward fighting retreat was achieving something unexpected. The Panthers had been positioned for an ambush, expecting to catch American tanks driving forward into the kill zone. But the Shermans had reversed that script by retreating while maintaining engagement. The Panthers were now fighting an enemy that was withdrawing in a controlled manner, not panicking and fleeing. This disrupted the Germans' ambush plan, because ambushes relied on surprise and target confusion. The Shermans were confused, but still fighting effectively, which wasn't how ambushed units were supposed to behave. Another Panther maneuvered to get a better shot at one of the reversing Shermans. In doing so, it exposed its side armor to Kovac's tank. Kovac called out the target, and Briggs traversed the turret slightly. The shot hit the Panther's side and penetrated, causing an internal fire. 2 Panthers down. By this point, approximately 3 minutes had elapsed since the maneuver began. The 3 remaining Shermans had reversed about 150 yards and were now behind effective cover. The Panthers could no longer see the Sherman hulls, only the turrets, and those were difficult targets at this range. The German commander made a tactical decision to advance and reacquire the American tanks. 4 Panthers began moving forward toward the ridge. This was exactly what Kovac had hoped would happen. The Panthers were leaving their prepared ambush positions and moving into open ground. As they advanced, they became more visible targets for the hull-down Shermans. The American tanks stopped reversing and began firing from their protected positions. From hull down, the Shermans had a significant advantage because only their turrets were exposed. The Panthers had to hit a much smaller target while exposing their entire hulls. One of the other Sherman tanks scored a hit on an advancing Panther, striking it in the lower glacis plate where the armor was weaker. The Panther stopped and its engine began smoking. 3 Panthers down. The remaining 3 Panthers halted their advance, realizing that pushing forward was costly. The German commander was facing a dilemma he hadn't anticipated. His ambush had been disrupted by an enemy that refused to behave conventionally. The Shermans had retreated to defensive positions and were now dug in. Dislodging them would require a coordinated assault, and that would take time to organize. Meanwhile, the American tanks had undoubtedly called for support. Artillery or air support could arrive at any moment. The German commander decided to withdraw his remaining Panthers. The ambush had failed, and staying in position risked losing more tanks. The 3 surviving Panthers pulled back into the tree line and disappeared. The engagement was over. Total elapsed time, approximately 5 minutes. Kovac's platoon had faced 6 Panthers and had destroyed or disabled 3 of them while losing only 1 Sherman. More importantly, they'd broken up the German ambush and prevented the Panthers from attacking other American forces. Kovac remained in his hull-down position for another 10 minutes until friendly artillery arrived. Shells began falling on the tree line where the Panthers had been, ensuring they wouldn't return. Only then did Kovac order his tank to turn around and drive forward to rejoin friendly forces. When Kovac's platoon returned to their unit, the story of their backward fighting retreat spread quickly. Other tank crews were incredulous because the maneuver seemed impossible. Reversing a tank while fighting violated everything they'd been taught. Lieutenant Hayes submitted a detailed after-action report describing the engagement. He credited Kovac with suggesting the maneuver and noted that it had probably saved the platoon from destruction. The report reached the 3rd Armored Division headquarters and generated considerable interest. Division staff officers wanted to understand exactly how the maneuver had worked. In late August, Kovac was summoned to division headquarters to brief senior officers. He explained his reasoning. Turning around would have exposed the thin rear armor and taken too long. Reversing kept the frontal armor toward the enemy and maintained the ability to shoot back. The slow reverse speed actually worked in their favor because it confused the German gunners. The officers asked if Kovac had practiced this maneuver during training. He admitted he hadn't because it wasn't in any training manual. He'd simply thought of it in the moment, based on his understanding of the Shermans' capabilities and the tactical situation. The division commander, Major General Maurice Rose, was impressed. He authorized immediate testing of the backward fighting maneuver to determine if it should be adopted as doctrine. In early September 1944, the 3rd Armored Division conducted training exercises to evaluate reverse combat operations. Tank crews practiced reversing in formation while maintaining gun discipline. The training revealed several challenges. Drivers needed extensive practice to reverse accurately, and commanders had to develop new techniques for navigation guidance. But the training also confirmed that the maneuver was viable when executed correctly. Crews who practiced the technique became proficient within a week. The key was coordination between the commander and driver, with the commander providing constant steering corrections. Gunners also needed to adjust, because firing from a reversing tank created different recoil dynamics. But these were learnable skills, not insurmountable obstacles. Based on the training results, the 3rd Armored Division issued tactical guidance on defensive reverse operations. The guidance specified when the maneuver was appropriate, facing superior enemy armor, needing to withdraw while maintaining fire, and having suitable terrain for hull-down positions. It wasn't intended for all situations, but for specific tactical circumstances where conventional retreat was too dangerous. Other American armored divisions heard about the technique and began incorporating it into their training. By October 1944, backward fighting retreats had become an accepted, if uncommon, tactical option. Several more engagements during the fall of 1944 demonstrated the technique's effectiveness. In one notable action near Aachen, a platoon of Shermans used reverse operations to withdraw from a superior German force. They destroyed 2 enemy tanks while suffering no losses themselves. In another engagement during the Battle of the Bulge, American tank crews reversed while fighting to break contact with Panthers. The maneuver bought time for reinforcements to arrive. The psychological impact on American tank crews was significant. Before Kovac's action, Sherman crews felt helpless when encountering Panthers or Tigers. The doctrine said to avoid engagement, but that often meant abandoning positions or fleeing. The backward fighting technique gave crews another option, a way to withdraw while still fighting. This improved morale because it meant Sherman crews weren't just victims of superior German armor. They had tactics that could level the playing field, at least partially. The German reaction to this tactic was documented in several captured after-action reports. German tank commanders noted that American Shermans had begun using unconventional withdrawal tactics. One report specifically mentioned tanks that reversed while maintaining fire, making accurate ranging difficult. German gunners were trained to lead moving targets based on forward motion. When targets moved backward instead, it disrupted their aiming calculations. Some German commanders issued guidance to watch for reversing tanks and adjust fire accordingly. But this was difficult to train because most German tank crews never encountered the tactic in combat. For his actions at Mortain, Kovac was awarded the Silver Star. The citation praised his tactical innovation and quick thinking under fire. It noted that his maneuver had not only saved his platoon, but had also contributed to defeating a German ambush that threatened American forces. Kovac was also promoted to technical sergeant and later to platoon sergeant. He continued fighting through the remainder of the war, participating in the drive across France and into Germany. He survived the war and returned to Cleveland in June 1945. After the war, Kovac used his GI Bill benefits to study mechanical engineering. He graduated from Case Institute of Technology in 1949 and worked as an automotive engineer for General Motors. He rarely talked about his tank combat experiences, considering himself just one of many soldiers who'd done their jobs. The backward fighting technique that Kovac pioneered continued to be taught in American armor training after the war. It became part of the formal curriculum at the armor school at Fort Knox. Tank crews were trained in defensive reverse operations as a standard tactical option. The technique proved valuable during the Korean War, when American M26 and M46 tanks faced Soviet-supplied T-34s. Several documented cases showed UN forces using reverse operations to break contact with superior numbers. The tactic remained relevant because the fundamental problem persisted. Sometimes you needed to withdraw while maintaining fire. Modern armored forces still train in reverse operations, though the technique has evolved with technology. Contemporary tanks have better reverse speeds, improved optics and backup cameras that make the maneuver easier. But the tactical principle remains what Kovač demonstrated in 1944, maintaining offensive capability while executing a defensive withdrawal. In the 1970s, military historians began researching tactical innovations of World War II. Dr. Stephen Zaloga, a historian specializing in armored warfare, came across references to Kovač's action at Mortain. He tracked Kovač down and interviewed him about the engagement. Kovač was 62 years old and retired from General Motors. He still remembered the Mortain action vividly, including specific details about the terrain and the Panther's positions. Dr. Zaloga asked Kovač what had made him think of fighting backward. Kovač explained that it was simple logic based on the Shermans' limitations. The tank's frontal armor was its strongest point, and the gun needed to face the enemy to be effective. Turning around would expose weaknesses and eliminate firepower for critical seconds. Reversing solved both problems, even though it created new challenges with navigation. Kovač said he'd been fortunate to have a skilled driver who could handle reversing under combat stress. Private Murphy's driving ability had been crucial to the maneuver's success. Dr. Zaloga asked if Kovač had been concerned about violating doctrine. Kovač admitted he'd thought about it briefly, but decided survival was more important than following rules. If the maneuver failed and he survived, he'd deal with the consequences. But if he followed doctrine and got his platoon killed, the rules wouldn't matter. The choice had been clear. Try something unconventional or die conventionally. Dr. Zaloga published a paper about Kovač's action in 1983 titled Tactical Innovation in Armored Warfare, the Mortain Reverse Engagement. The paper analyzed the engagement from a tactical perspective and examined how the technique had spread through the army. It also discussed the broader principle of tactical adaptation, soldiers modifying doctrine based on combat experience. The paper generated interest among military professionals and led to renewed discussion of tactical flexibility. Kovač was invited to speak at several military conferences in the 1980s. He emphasized that his maneuver wasn't about being creative for its own sake. It was about understanding your equipment's capabilities and the tactical situation. If you knew what your tank could do and understood the terrain and enemy, you could find solutions that weren't in the manual. Kovač argued that tactical doctrine was important, but shouldn't be treated as absolute. Doctrine provided guidelines, but battlefield conditions varied infinitely. Commanders needed to exercise judgment and adapt tactics to specific circumstances. In 1994, the U.S. Armor Association established the Michael Kovač Award for Tactical Innovation. The award recognizes armor soldiers who develop or employ innovative tactics in combat or training. It's presented annually to individuals who demonstrate creative problem-solving under pressure. The award criteria explicitly encourage thinking beyond standard doctrine when situations demand it. Kovač attended the first award ceremony and gave a brief speech. He thanked the association, but noted that thousands of tank crews had shown similar innovation during the war. Many had adapted tactics to survive and accomplish missions. His backward fighting maneuver just happened to be documented and recognized. Countless others had done equally creative things that went unrecorded. Michael Kovač died in 2008 at the age of 87. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer highlighted his Silver Star and his tactical innovation at Mortain. It noted that his backward fighting technique had become standard doctrine and was still taught at armor training schools. The Armor magazine published a detailed tribute that explored Kovač's contribution to armored warfare. The tribute emphasized that Kovač had demonstrated the importance of tactical flexibility. He'd faced a situation where standard doctrine would have failed, and he'd improvised a solution. That kind of adaptive thinking was what separated good soldiers from great ones. The impact of Kovač's innovation extended beyond the specific engagement at Mortain. His action changed how American tank crews thought about defensive operations. Before August 1944, withdrawal meant turning around and driving away as fast as possible. After Kovač's demonstration, withdrawal could mean a controlled reverse while maintaining fire. This expanded the tactical options available to tank commanders, The technique also influenced tank design in subsequent years. Post-war American tanks were designed with better reverse capabilities than the Sherman had. The M26 Pershing, M46 Patton, and later M48 and M60 tanks all had improved reverse speeds and better driver visibility when reversing. These improvements were partly motivated by the recognition that reverse operations were tactically valuable. Modern main battle tanks like the M1 Abrams can reverse at significant speeds and have cameras that make reversing easier. The principle that Kovač demonstrated in his Sherman remains relevant: maintaining combat effectiveness while withdrawing. Kovač's story also became a case study in military leadership education. Officer training programs use it to teach initiative and tactical judgment. The case demonstrates that subordinates can sometimes see solutions that aren't apparent to their superiors. Lieutenant Hayes's willingness to accept Kovač's unconventional suggestion was as important as Kovač's idea itself. Good leadership meant being open to input from experienced subordinates. The engagement at Mortain also illustrates an important principle about military innovation. Most tactical innovations don't come from high-level planning or theoretical analysis. They come from soldiers on the ground facing immediate problems and improvising solutions. Kovač didn't develop his technique in a training exercise or through careful study. He thought of it in a life-or-death situation and executed it with his crew. The fact that it worked and was adopted by others showed that bottom-up innovation could be highly effective. The comparison between Kovač's achievement and other wartime innovations reveals common patterns. Like Margaret Hastings with bomber repairs, Eleanor Morrison with bulkhead gaskets, Dorothy Levitt with parachute harnesses, and Edward Huxtable with his torpedo attack, Kovač succeeded by understanding fundamentals and adapting to circumstances. He didn't have better equipment or superior numbers. He had a thorough understanding of his tank's capabilities and the tactical situation. That understanding allowed him to see an option that others might have missed. Kovač's innovation was recognizing that the Sherman's limitations could be managed through unconventional maneuvering. The frontal armor, while inadequate against Panthers head-on, was still better than the rear armor. The main gun needed to face the enemy to provide suppressive fire. Reversing satisfied both requirements, even though it created navigation challenges. This demonstrates that effective tactical thinking involves understanding trade-offs. Every decision has advantages and disadvantages, and the key is choosing the option where advantages outweigh disadvantages. Another important aspect of Kovač's action was his crew's skill and teamwork. The backward fighting maneuver required exceptional coordination between the commander, driver, and gunner. Private Murphy had to reverse the tank over rough terrain using limited visibility while under fire. Corporal Briggs had to maintain accurate fire from a reversing platform. Kovač had to navigate, guide the driver, and direct the gunner simultaneously. This level of coordination only came from extensive training and mutual trust. The best tactics fail without skilled execution. The psychological aspect of the maneuver also deserves recognition. Executing an untried tactic under fire required enormous courage. The crew had to trust Kovač's judgment and their own abilities. There was no guarantee the maneuver would work, and failure would likely mean death, but they committed to it fully and executed it precisely. That combination of courage and skill was what made the maneuver successful. The engagement at Mortain also demonstrated the value of aggressive defense. Kovač's platoon was withdrawing, which is normally a passive defensive action, but by maintaining fire while withdrawing, they turned retreat into an active defensive operation. They damaged enemy tanks, disrupted the German ambush, and bought time for reinforcements. The retreat became a tactical success rather than just a survival exercise. This principle, aggressive defense, has broad application beyond tank warfare. In any situation where you're forced to withdraw, maintaining offensive capability can turn a disadvantage into an opportunity. The specific tactics vary by context, but the principle remains constant. In thinking about Kovač's legacy, several important themes emerge. First, the importance of understanding your equipment thoroughly. Kovač knew what his Sherman could and couldn't do, which allowed him to exploit its capabilities creatively. Second, the value of adaptive thinking in combat. Doctrine provided a foundation, but Kovač recognized when the situation demanded something different. Third, the power of crew coordination and training. Even the best tactical idea fails without skilled execution by a cohesive team. Fourth, the importance of courage and commitment. Trying an untested maneuver under fire required confidence and determination. Finally, Kovač's story shows that tactical innovations often come from unexpected sources. A tank sergeant facing a specific problem developed a technique that changed armored doctrine. Michael Kovač was a tank commander in the 3rd Armored Division. He wasn't a general or a tactics instructor, but when faced with a situation where conventional tactics would fail, he improvised a solution that saved his platoon. His backward fighting technique became standard doctrine and is still taught today. That's the essence of tactical excellence: understanding capabilities, recognizing opportunities, and executing with precision. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories, because each story reveals something important about courage, innovation, and tactical thinking under pressure. And we'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community includes veterans, tank enthusiasts, historians, and people fascinated by how creative tactics can overcome superior firepower. You're part of something meaningful here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these important stories alive.